So I'm back now. I'm going to give you guys a little bit more time just to work on this because I did it quite quickly. So I'm back now. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit more time to work on this, this background section. The next thing we're going to be putting in is the lighter tone for the skull, so the sort of lightest portion of the skull. So one thing I'm going to do actually while you're carrying on is I'm just going to clean down my palette a bit because we're going to be mixing some different. I'm going to be mixing some greens for the leaves quite soon, so I don't want too much grey all over my palette. So if you're the same, once you finish your background and you have your whole palette covered with paint, I recommend giving a bit of a clean down. So you can either scrape it with if you've got a lot of paint built up, you can scrape it with a palette knife, or just give it a wipe if you don't have much. I'm also going to give my kind of medium and smaller size bristle a bit of a clean. So those are going to be the two brushes I use primarily in the leaves and the skull for the dead colouring. So you're hopefully roughly caught up. What I want you to do now is just pop out the rest of your pigments, not necessarily a huge amount of them, just a small dab of each. So you want your yellow ochre, Prussian blue, or whatever equivalent blue you're using, or equivalent colors to these. cadmium yellow. You only probably need a touch of cadmium yellow and of the blue because they're quite strong high tinting strength. High tinting strength just means that they, when mixed with a color with lower tinting strength, they'll sort of obliterate that color to a certain extent. Just forget how oily cadmium red is. So I don't actually know if I'll be using cadmium red, but I'll pop it out. If you're doing the second picture, the girl, you'll definitely be using cadmium red, and if you're doing the third one as well, actually, with the skull. But this one's a lot more green focused, so it'll be more yellow and blue that you'll be using if you're working along with this one. So the first thing I want to do, we're going to try to get our lightest, we're going to put our lightest tones in now. So we want to start with a mixture. It's not even necessarily going to be a mixture. It's pretty much just pure white. We're going to place where it's lightest on our painting. So what portion of your light subject is lightest? In the deer skull, it's sort of around about here, roughly, is where the light's hitting and it's sort of turning towards the light source and it's strongest. It is pretty light all the way down, but that's going to be our focus for where we want it to look lightest. If you're working from the little girl's face, it's sort of just to the right, her right cheek, sort of top of her right cheek is very bright. If you're working from the skull, it's sort of more, I would say, probably like the inner corner of the eye, that light bit of the eye catching light kind of moving down the front of the face. There are some highlights down the left-hand side of it, but it tends to kind of get a little bit darker as the light travels. So you want to look for, if you blur your eyes, what stands out and glows the lightest to you. That's where you're going to put your pure white. So as I say, I've got mine, I would say in the skull, it's sort of roughly around here. And for the time being, we won't mix any colors into this white. We're just going to place it just to try to get an idea for our brightest tone. Probably means I'm going to have to mess around, I think, with my exposure again because it's going to be a lot lighter. But yeah, just a patch there that roughly matches your light tone. I might leave mine like that for now and just see if it holds relative to the shadows. So that's your lightest tone. And what we want to start looking for this dead coloring stage, we're not going loads into all the different form changes. We're going to just look for a transition from this lightest tone towards the shadows. And then we will be going back to the shadows and sort of darkening them where necessary as well. So we've got our lightest portions. Maybe a little bit here is quite light as well. Anywhere where you see it looking very light to you. Kind of a little bit up there, maybe not so much. Yeah, that bit. Slightly down here. But what we're looking for, ideally, is some sort of fall of light. So we want to sense that there's this lightest point of the light form, the skull, and then it gets gradually darker as it turns away from that. So as we start to mix our sort of transitions away, let's just stick to begin with just a little bit of yellow ochre mixed in, possibly a touch of burnt umber just to sort of redden it. And we'll try that just as basically mixing an off-white, more of a sort of cream color. And so we're just going through really big kind of loose patches of gradually darker tones moving away from these lighter points. But as I say, you don't have to go into loads of detail of the individual forms. That's what we're going to build on top of next week. Sometimes what we're doing, so this what we're calling sort of, it's dead coloring, but it's also building a fall of light. So you're sort of looking at as we go down away from that lightest point, how it's getting lighter. Generally in the lights, you want to use a little bit less medium. But as you go towards the darker halftones, you can start to use a little bit more medium. But usually for the lightest lights, you sort of start with more thick paint. So we're going to be building up a lot more thick paint in the lighter portions of the painting. And if you have, so here for me, for instance, the skull value, as it kind of tucks in underneath the top section, where the eye socket overlaps, it goes about the same value as my raw umber preparation, or the umber preparation, gray brown. So I just leave that. So if the value or if the color is correct, as it already is with the preparation below, just work with that. You don't have to mix a new color for everything. The point of having the prepared panel is that it saves you time if you've got sections of halftones that match it. Generally with the skull, as it goes into the halftones, you don't want it to go too orangey. So you might need to incorporate a little bit of gray and white just to gray it off. If you're just using burnt umber, it might go a bit too kind of reddish orange. So just keep an eye out for that. That's why the black is actually quite useful to have on your palette. It's always an effective grayer way to incorporate more gray. Just going to try to mess with my exposure a little bit more. That's worse. Yes, that's probably darkened out the background slightly, but you should hopefully see the mixtures in the skull a little bit more clearly, those more subtle mixtures that we're working on at the moment. Because it is quite subtle, the transitions kind of going through from light to dark with this skull. All of them, because they're lit by daylight, are fairly sort of quite subtle tones, which is nice once we get into the later stages, but it's a bit trickier. If you don't have like really strong contrasty shapes, it can be trickier at this stage to kind of block things in, but a lot more fun later on. So this little bit of the eye socket juts back out a bit, so it goes lighter again, whereas around it maybe it was a little bit darker. So that's not too bad for the lights of the skull. But I want to go in and just start to put in some of the darker sort of halftones as well. And I'm not trying to fully turn the form just yet. That's going to be next week. But I do just want to get a kind of like a lane of the right types of colors for those halftones. But you can see I'm mostly keeping the color mixtures pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Nothing too complex. So you should be able to see a sort of just gradual development of the kind of major tones in the skull. So I'm going to try to, as I say, refrain from putting too much detail into it just yet. That's going to be next week. But I don't want to miss out sort of the way that I'm transitioning into the halftones. What I want you to also pay attention to, so for mine, my major paint mixtures here have been, for the lightest portion of the skull, it's white with a tiny bit of cadmium yellow mixed into it. And then gradually adding a bit of burnt umber as it goes darker. Once I get to these darker halftones, I'm using more ivory black mixed in. So you can see there are some of these cooler shifts. And you want to try to kind of remember those mixtures. If you can remember what you mix, it's going to make it easier when you're working on the smaller forms in the skull to just sort of replicate what you've already done. So that's not too bad for the lights as far as dead coloring goes. I'm going to try to keep roughly sort of on pace to get everything essentially blocked in at this stage. Which means I want to jump now back to the shadows in the skull. So what's become apparent is my shadow in the skull is not as dark as it ought to be. So now that everything's in place, I can sort of see the darkest tones and the lightest tones. the shadow in the skull needs to merge more with the value of the background, the shadow next to it, than with the light. So at the moment, it's too close to the value of the lights. So I can take my brush, just give it a bit of a clean. We're going to be using the same colors. Got all our colors out on the palette now. And I just need to mix up a slightly less orangey, so it's a little bit too orangey in terms of hue, my color, and a darker tone. So I'll do that with, so my starting point will be the burnt umber. But as I say, that's probably, if we pop it on, that's just a little bit too sort of orangey. So we'll just mix a bit of the gray into it. So black and white mixed into that, to make a slightly, that's a little bit too much white. To make a grayer shadow color. And you can just test it out. So mix a batch of it up, paint it on, see how it looks to you, whether it seems about right. It's not too far off. And then once you're happy with your shadow tone, you can paint that in. It's probably going to be a roughly kind of even tone. There's not going to be as much variation within the shadows. There'll be a little bit, so there's going to be a lighter portion of the shadow in the core, usually with some reflected lights. It's a delicate balance between sort of how grey you need to make it and not going too grey so it sort of feels deadened. Or too deadened. We are working in dead colouring, obviously. So you can do that through the rest of the shadows of the skull. And then if need be, you can do, there's a few kind of like slightly subtler transitions you can work on between the halftones and the lights, but you don't want to go, as I say, don't go too overboard with that sort of stuff just yet. That's what we'll be getting into more next week. And we've still got a bit more work to do in the rest of the dead colouring of the painting. So yeah, for the skull, I think that's probably going to be sufficient. We might revisit it right at the end, depending on how quickly we get through the rest of the piece. It's going to be a little bit of time spent on these leaves next. But you should be able to see, so there's just this, the primary thing I'm looking for at this stage is just this sense that there's a lighter tone right in the center of the skull. And then gradually, as we move towards the shadows on the skull, things are getting a little bit darker. So I'm looking for that major form. It doesn't matter too much if your colors aren't exactly right, like the hue of the skull. Maybe mine is slightly cooler than it is in the reference. You can change that, so that's something that is sort of up to you. As I say, it's more subjective color than value. But primarily, you're just looking for that value shift so that it's lighter in the lightest portion, the core part of the object that's receiving direct light. And then it's gradually darker as it goes towards the shadows. So in this case, it's sort of towards that left-hand side. And then you might need to make some adjustments to the value of the shadows to kind of make sure they merge correctly with the right part of the image. But yeah, on the whole, that's all you're looking for at this stage for that skull or the face, that primary object. So what you can do is, if you finish that, I'm just gonna let you work on it a little bit, check in with my full tutored student, and then we'll carry on with the leaves. Well, in my case, it's going to be leaves. It's either going to be leaves or flowers, depending on what you're working on, or leaves and flowers if you're working on the second image. So yeah, I'll let you work on that just for a few minutes, and I'll be back soon.